Ladies and gentlemen, today we embark on a journey into one of the most mysterious and isolated places on Earth, North Sentinel Island. Hidden deep within the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, this island has remained untouched by modern civilization for thousands of years. It is home to the Sentinelese, one of the last uncontacted tribes in the world, fiercely resisting any outside influence. The Sentinelese people are among the last truly uncontacted tribes on Earth, with an ancestry stretching back tens of thousands of years. They are believed to have descended from the first humans who migrated out of Africa, possibly over 60,000 years ago, making them one of the oldest continuous human populations still living in isolation. Unlike other indigenous groups that have undergone gradual cultural evolution and external interactions, the Sentinelese have managed to maintain their way of life with minimal outside influence. The Andaman Islands, where North Sentinel Island is located, have been home to various indigenous groups for thousands of years. These groups include the Great Andamanese, Onge, Jarwa, and the Sentinelese, but among them, the Sentinelese have remained the most secluded. While other tribes have gradually come into contact with modern civilization, leading to the loss of their traditional ways of life, the Sentinelese have fiercely resisted any form of interaction, ensuring their customs, language, and way of life remain undisturbed. Archaeological evidence from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands suggests that early human settlements existed on these islands for millennia. Stone tools and other artifacts found on nearby islands indicate that prehistoric humans adapted to the dense jungles and marine ecosystems of the Andaman region. Though there are no direct archaeological excavations on North Sentinel Island, due to the extreme hostility of its inhabitants, many experts believe the Sentinelese have followed a hunter-gatherer lifestyle for generations, relying on the island's rich natural resources for survival. Scientists and anthropologists theorize that the Sentinelese culture, traditions, and social structures have been passed down orally for thousands of years. Since they have never developed agriculture or large-scale domestication of animals, they likely continue to live in small, self-sufficient groups, using rudimentary tools and techniques for hunting and gathering. Despite their ancient lineage, the Sentinelese have not adopted many of the advancements seen in other indigenous cultures, such as pottery or advanced weaponry. Instead, they have perfected survival in one of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth. Due to their extreme isolation, the Sentinelese are genetically distinct from other populations. Researchers studying DNA samples from related tribes in the Andaman Islands have found that these indigenous groups have unique genetic markers, indicating minimal interbreeding with outsiders. This makes the Sentinelese an important population for understanding early human migration and genetic diversity. However, because of their resistance to contact, no direct genetic studies have ever been conducted on them. Their isolation has also protected them from many of the diseases that have devastated indigenous populations elsewhere. Unlike groups that came into contact with European explorers and suffered from outbreaks of smallpox, measles, and influenza, the Sentinelese have remained free from such pandemics, at least until an outsider inadvertently exposes them to modern pathogens. This is one of the main reasons why experts advocate for their continued isolation. A simple cold or flu, harmless to modern humans, could lead to catastrophic consequences for their small and vulnerable population. Despite being untouched by modern civilization, the Sentinelese demonstrate an advanced understanding of their environment. They have developed specialized techniques for hunting, fishing, and building shelters that allow them to thrive in their remote habitat. Their knowledge of edible plants, medicinal herbs, and seasonal changes suggests that their ancestors have passed down critical survival skills through countless generations. North Sentinel Island serves as a living time capsule, preserving a way of life that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. It offers a rare glimpse into the survival strategies of prehistoric humans and provides valuable insights into how early human societies functioned before the advent of agriculture and modern technology. The Sentinelese people stand as a testament to human resilience, proving that an ancient way of life can endure even in the face of a rapidly changing world. North Sentinel Island is one of the most secluded places on Earth, both geographically and culturally. Located in the Bay of Bengal, it is part of India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands, a remote archipelago that itself is distant from the Indian mainland. Despite being under Indian jurisdiction, the island and its inhabitants remain largely untouched by modern civilization due to their extreme isolation and hostility toward outsiders. This natural and self-imposed seclusion has made North Sentinel Island one of the least explored and most mysterious places in the world. The island itself is relatively small, covering an area of about 60 square kilometers, 23 square miles, roughly the size of Manhattan. It is densely covered with thick tropical rainforests, making it nearly impenetrable except for the narrow beaches that surround it. The island's interior is largely unknown, as even aerial surveys provide only a limited view due to the heavy canopy of trees. It is believed that the Sentinelese have small settlements within the forest, where they live hidden from sight, reinforcing their isolation. One of the most significant factors contributing to the Sentinelese people's isolation is the island's natural defenses. North Sentinel Island is surrounded by coral reefs, which act as a formidable barrier against incoming boats and ships. These reefs make navigation extremely difficult, and in many cases, dangerous. The waters around the island are shallow and filled with jagged coral formations that can easily damage or wreck boats. Many ships have run aground on these reefs, including the MV Primrose, a cargo ship that became stranded near the island in 1981. When the crew attempted to signal for help, the Sentinelese responded aggressively, making it clear that outsiders were not welcome. The Sentinelese people's hostility toward outsiders has further reinforced the island's isolation. Unlike other indigenous tribes in the Andaman region who have, to some extent, integrated with modern society, the Sentinelese have consistently attacked anyone who attempts to come ashore. They have used bows, arrows, and spears to drive away intruders, often launching arrows at helicopters and boats that come too close. Their violent resistance has been well documented over the years, with numerous incidents where visitors, both intentional and accidental, have been met with aggression. The island's isolation is also maintained by strict legal protections enforced by the Indian government. Recognizing the dangers of disturbing the Sentinelese way of life, the Indian authorities have declared North Sentinel Island a no-go zone. No one is allowed to approach within 5 nautical miles, 9.26 kilometers, of the island, and the Indian Navy actively patrols the surrounding waters to ensure that the tribe remains undisturbed. These protections are in place not only to preserve the Sentinelese culture, but also to safeguard outsiders from potential attacks and to prevent the spread of diseases that could devastate the tribe. Another crucial aspect of the island's isolation is the Sentinelese people's complete independence from modern civilization. Unlike many other indigenous tribes, they have no recorded history of trade, communication, or interaction with outside groups. They do not use metal tools, domesticate animals, or cultivate crops. Instead, they rely entirely on hunting, fishing, and gathering for survival. They are believed to craft their weapons and tools from natural resources found on the island, such as wood, stone, and shells. Occasionally, they have been observed repurposing metal from shipwrecks, fashioning it into spear tips and arrowheads, but they have never actively sought external materials. The island's geographical isolation has also contributed to its linguistic and cultural uniqueness. Because the Sentinelese have been cut off from the rest of the world for thousands of years, their language is entirely unclassified and unrelated to any known languages spoken in the Andaman Islands or beyond. This means that even the indigenous people from neighboring islands, such as the Onge and the Jarwa, cannot understand the Sentinelese language, further reinforcing their isolation. Since no meaningful communication has ever been established with the Sentinelese, their beliefs, traditions, and customs remain a complete mystery. Despite being physically cut off from the outside world, the Sentinelese have shown remarkable adaptability in surviving on the island. They have thrived for thousands of years without agriculture or external resources, demonstrating an intricate understanding of their environment. They know which plants are edible, how to track and hunt animals, and how to fish in the surrounding waters. Their survival techniques have been passed down through generations, allowing them to exist in harmony with their natural surroundings. While the island's isolation has protected the Sentinelese from the modern world, it also poses significant risks. The biggest threat to their existence is the introduction of diseases from outsiders. Because they have been separated from other human populations for thousands of years, they have not developed immunity to common illnesses such as the flu, measles, or even the common cold. Any contact with the outside world, even a brief one, could lead to a devastating outbreak that could wipe out their small population. This vulnerability has been seen in other indigenous groups, such as the Great Andamanese, whose numbers were drastically reduced due to disease after contact with British colonizers. North Sentinel Island stands as a rare example of a completely untouched human civilization, living as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. It is one of the last remaining places on Earth where a society exists without any dependence on modern technology, trade, or external influence. Their continued isolation is a reminder of how some cultures have chosen to resist change and preserve their ancient way of life, despite the pressures of the modern world. The Sentinelese people are among the most fiercely independent and hostile tribes in the world. Unlike many other indigenous groups that have, over time, engaged with outsiders to some degree, the Sentinelese have consistently and violently rejected any form of contact. Their hostility toward outsiders is not merely an aggressive stance, but a deeply rooted survival strategy that has protected them from the dangers of the outside world for thousands of years. One of the key reasons for their aggressive defense of their territory is their long history of negative interactions with outsiders. While we do not have written records of every encounter, the few documented instances suggest that most attempts at contact have resulted in trauma, illness, or death for the Sentinelese. This has reinforced their belief that any outsiders pose a threat to their survival. The Sentinelese are known to attack approaching boats, helicopters, and even wrecked ships. They use bows, arrows, spears, and stones to drive away anyone who dares to come near. Unlike many tribes that may have initially shown curiosity toward outsiders before adopting hostility, the Sentinelese have maintained their defensive stance for centuries. One of the earliest known encounters with the Sentinelese occurred in 1880, when British officer Maurice Vidal Portman led an expedition to North Sentinel Island. The British had already colonized parts of the Andaman Islands and had made contact with other indigenous groups in the region. However, when they landed on North Sentinel, they found the islanders hiding in the jungle. Portman's team captured an elderly couple and 4 children and took them to Port Blair, the capital of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Unfortunately, the elderly pair quickly fell ill and died, likely due to exposure to foreign diseases. The British then hurriedly returned the children to the island with gifts, but this traumatic event likely reinforced the tribe's hostility toward outsiders. After this disastrous first contact, the Sentinelese remained aggressively defensive. For nearly a century, they were left alone, with only rare encounters when lost fishermen or explorers unintentionally ended up near the island. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Indian government made multiple attempts to establish peaceful contact. Anthropologists and officials occasionally visited the island, leaving gifts such as coconuts, metal tools, and food in an effort to initiate communication. While there were a few moments where the Sentinelese seemed less aggressive, sometimes accepting gifts without immediate attacks, these attempts never led to any long-term success. More often than not, they fired arrows at the approaching boats, making it clear they wanted no further interaction. One of the most famous incidents of Sentinelese hostility occurred in 2006, when 2 fishermen were killed after their boat accidentally drifted near the island. The men had been illegally fishing in the area and had fallen asleep, unaware that ocean currents had carried them too close to North Sentinel. The Sentinelese attacked and killed them, leaving their bodies on the shore. When the Indian Coast Guard attempted to recover the bodies using a helicopter, the Sentinelese fired arrows at the aircraft, forcing it to retreat. the government ultimately decided to leave the bodies behind, respecting the tribe's isolation. A more recent and widely publicized case occurred in 2018 when an American missionary, John Allen Chow, illegally traveled to North Sentinel Island in an attempt to convert the Sentinelese to Christianity. Chow had planned his mission for years and paid fishermen to secretly take him close to the island. When he first approached, the Sentinelese shot an arrow that struck his Bible. Despite this warning, he made another attempt the next day, at which point he was killed and buried on the beach. His death sparked international debate about indigenous rights, the ethics of forced contact, and the responsibility of governments to protect uncontacted tribes. The Sentinelese hostility is not simply an act of aggression, it is a means of survival. History has shown that when uncontacted tribes come into contact with the outside world, they often suffer devastating consequences. The Great Andamanese, a related indigenous group in the region, once had a population of over 5,000. After contact with British colonizers, their numbers plummeted to just a few dozen due to disease, violence, and displacement. The Sentinelese have likely witnessed the destruction of neighboring tribes and have chosen to defend their way of life at all costs. The Indian government, recognizing the dangers of forced contact, has enforced strict protections for North Sentinel Island. The tribe is legally protected under the Andaman and Nicobar Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation, 1956, which prohibits any attempt to approach or interact with the Sentinelese. The government has since abandoned all contact missions, allowing the tribe to remain undisturbed in their natural habitat. Another key factor in their hostility is their isolation from global diseases. Because the Sentinelese have lived without exposure to the outside world for thousands of years, they have no immunity to common illnesses. Even a simple flu virus or cold could wipe out their entire population. This has happened before with other indigenous groups. When the Aztecs and Incas came into contact with European explorers, diseases such as smallpox decimated their populations. The Sentinelese instinctively understand that outsiders bring danger, whether in the form of physical harm or invisible sicknesses. In addition to disease, the Sentinelese also resist external influence to protect their cultural identity and autonomy. Unlike many indigenous groups that have been assimilated into modern society, the Sentinelese have maintained their hunter-gatherer lifestyle for thousands of years without adopting agriculture, modern tools, or external technologies. While some evidence suggests they have occasionally used metal from shipwrecks to create tools or weapons, they have never sought trade or interaction with outsiders. Their continued hostility serves as a stark reminder that not all civilizations seek contact, progress, or integration. The Sentinelese have made it clear that they do not want to be disturbed, and they have been willing to fight to preserve their way of life. Their island is one of the last places on Earth where an ancient human culture remains untouched by globalization, and their aggressive defense of their home ensures that they remain one of the world's most mysterious and protected people. The Sentinelese have lived in isolation for thousands of years, resisting contact with the outside world. However, one of the earliest and most significant documented encounters between the Sentinelese and outsiders occurred in the late 19th century, during the British colonial period in India. This encounter, led by a British naval officer named Maurice Vidal Portman, marked the first known attempt to study and interact with the Sentinelese. The consequences of this expedition would leave a lasting impression on the tribe, reinforcing their deep hostility toward outsiders. During the British Raj, 1858 to 1947, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were of strategic importance to the colonial administration. The British had already established settlements on several islands, using them primarily as penal colonies for Indian prisoners. In their attempts to expand control over the region, the British sought to study and, in some cases, civilize the indigenous groups living in the Andaman Islands. The Great Andamanese, Onge, and Jarwa tribes had all been contacted by this time, but North Sentinel Island remained unexplored. In 1880, Maurice Vidal Portman, an officer in the Indian Navy, led an expedition to North Sentinel Island with the goal of surveying the land, and establishing contact with the Sentinelese. Portman and his team landed on the island, expecting to find the Sentinelese waiting to greet them, as had been the case with some other Andaman tribes. Instead, they found abandoned huts and pathways leading into the dense jungle, suggesting that the Sentinelese had fled into the forest as soon as they detected the foreigners' arrival. This response demonstrated an instinct for self-preservation. Rather than confronting the well-armed British forces, they chose to retreat and avoid conflict. As Portman and his men explored the island, they came across evidence of the Sentinelese way of life. They found thatched huts, small cooking fires, and primitive tools made of wood and stone. However, what they did not find was the people themselves. The Sentinelese had effectively disappeared into the jungle, refusing to engage with the intruders. Determined to study the islanders, Portman's team captured 6 Sentinelese individuals, an elderly couple and 4 children, and forcibly took them to Port Blair, the colonial headquarters in the Andaman Islands. The British likely intended to observe their behavior, document their physical characteristics, and perhaps even attempt to educate them about modern civilization, as had been done with other indigenous groups in the region. However, the consequences of this abduction were disastrous. Within days of arriving at Port Blair, the elderly couple fell ill and died, most likely due to exposure to foreign diseases. The Sentinelese, having lived in complete isolation for thousands of years, had no immunity to common illnesses that were harmless to the British but lethal to them. The children also showed signs of illness, prompting the British to hastily return them to their island along with gifts such as food and metal tools. It is unknown what happened to the children after their return, but this traumatic event likely reinforced the Sentinelese people's belief that outsiders were dangerous and should never be trusted. Portman later admitted that his attempts to study the Sentinelese had failed. Unlike other tribes that had, to some extent, been forced into interaction with the British, the Sentinelese showed no interest in communication or integration. Instead, they maintained their isolation, and the hostility they displayed in later encounters suggested that they viewed the British as a threat rather than as potential allies. This first colonial encounter set the stage for the Sentinelese extreme hostility toward all outsiders. While the British continued to interact with other Andaman tribes, many of whom suffered greatly from disease, violence, and cultural disruption, the Sentinelese remained untouched. Their aggressive resistance ensured that the British never attempted to colonize North Sentinel Island, leaving it as one of the few places in the world that remained outside of colonial control. The impact of this early encounter was profound. The Sentinelese likely associated outsiders with death and disease, which explains why they have continued to attack intruders with unwavering aggression. The deaths of their elders, the forced separation of their children, and the strange objects left behind by the British may have convinced them that contact with the outside world would only bring suffering. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British largely left North Sentinel Island alone, focusing instead on other parts of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. By the time India gained independence in 1947, North Sentinel Island was still uncolonized, and its people remained as mysterious and untouched as they had been thousands of years earlier. Despite their isolation, the Sentinelese were not completely unaware of the outside world. Over the years, shipwrecks and floating debris from the modern world would occasionally wash up on their shores. While the British had abandoned their attempts to interact with them, other travelers, explorers, and later, the Indian government would make further efforts, most of which would be met with the same hostility first witnessed in 1880. Maurice Vidal Portman's failed expedition serves as a crucial historical lesson about the dangers of forcing contact with uncontacted tribes. The Sentinelese did not seek out outsiders, nor did they express any desire to join the modern world. Instead, they made it clear that they wished to be left alone, a stance they have continued to maintain for over a century. Over the years, various governments, researchers, and explorers have attempted to establish contact with the Sentinelese, but these efforts have consistently failed. Every approach, whether by colonial administrators, anthropologists, or missionaries, has been met with hostility, further reinforcing the tribe's fierce isolation. The repeated failure to communicate with the Sentinelese serves as a stark reminder of their determination to remain untouched by the outside world. The first recorded attempt to make peaceful contact with the Sentinelese was made by the British in the late 19th century, when Maurice Vidal Portman led an expedition to North Sentinel Island. As previously mentioned, this disastrous mission resulted in the deaths of 2 Sentinelese elders, likely due to disease, and a hasty return of the surviving children. This traumatic experience may have played a significant role in shaping the Sentinelese people's future distrust of outsiders. After this event, the British largely abandoned efforts to interact with the tribe, focusing instead on colonizing other parts of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. For the next several decades, the Sentinelese remained largely undisturbed, except for occasional shipwrecks or accidental intrusions. However, in the 20th century, with the development of modern transportation and an increased interest in studying isolated tribes, new efforts were made to reach them. One of the first modern attempts at peaceful contact occurred in 1967, when an Indian anthropological team, led by Triloknath Pundit, began a series of expeditions to North Sentinel Island. Unlike the British, the Indian government aimed to establish friendly relations with the Sentinelese rather than forcibly study them. Pundit and his team would periodically visit the island, leaving behind gifts such as coconuts, bananas, metal tools, and red cloth in an effort to gain the tribe's trust. Initially, the Sentinelese avoided direct interaction, often watching from a distance while the researchers left offerings on the beach. However, over time, they began to accept the gifts without immediate hostility. This gave researchers hope that a peaceful relationship could be developed. In 1991, after more than 2 decades of cautious attempts, the Sentinelese finally allowed Pundit's team to come closer. On one particular visit, they even approached the Anthropologists' boat and took coconuts directly from their hands. This moment was historic. It was the only known instance of nonviolent, face-to-face interaction with the Sentinelese. However, even in this brief encounter, the tribe remained cautious and alert. They accepted the gifts but showed no interest in further communication. They did not attempt to speak with the visitors, nor did they invite them deeper into the island. This interaction, while encouraging, did not lead to sustained contact. Despite this temporary breakthrough, the Sentinelese quickly reverted to their usual hostile stance. On subsequent visits, they once again began firing arrows at approaching boats, signaling that they did not wish for further interaction. This pattern of initial acceptance followed by rejection suggested that the Sentinelese saw no benefit in prolonged contact and preferred to be left alone. The Indian government eventually recognized that forcing communication was neither ethical nor practical. By the late 1990s, they abandoned active efforts to establish contact, shifting their focus toward protecting the tribe's isolation. In 2005, India officially declared that no further attempts would be made to reach the Sentinelese, acknowledging that any contact posed a grave threat to their health and culture. Even after these official policies were put in place, some individuals still attempted to make contact, often with tragic results. In 2006, 2 fishermen were killed after their boat drifted too close to the island. And in 2018, American missionary John Allen Chau was also killed when he illegally tried to approach the Sentinelese in an effort to convert them to Christianity. These incidents reaffirmed the dangers of attempting to reach the tribe and reinforced the need for strict legal protections around North Sentinel Island. The repeated failures of contact missions highlight an important reality. The Sentinelese have survived for thousands of years without outside help, and they have consistently demonstrated no interest in engaging with modern civilization. While many other indigenous tribes have, over time, been integrated into national societies, sometimes willingly, but often forcibly, the Sentinelese remain one of the last truly uncontacted peoples on Earth. Despite their extreme isolation, the Sentinelese have not been completely cut off from the outside world. Over the years, shipwrecks and accidental intrusions have led to brief, but often dangerous encounters between the tribe and outsiders. These incidents have provided rare glimpses into Sentinelese behavior, their reaction to modern objects, and their unwavering hostility toward anyone who trespasses on their island. The waters surrounding North Sentinel Island are known for their treacherous coral reefs, which have caused numerous ships to run aground over the centuries. Many of these wrecks have played a significant role in the Sentinelese people's exposure to the outside world. Unlike other tribes that actively sought trade with foreign visitors, the Sentinelese have only interacted with modern objects when they have washed ashore, often incorporating them into their tools and weapons. One of the earliest recorded shipwrecks near North Sentinel occurred in 1867, when an Indian merchant ship, the Nineveh, ran aground on the reefs near the island. The passengers and crew managed to make it to the beach, but they were soon attacked by the Sentinelese, who emerged from the jungle wielding bows, arrows, and spears. The stranded sailors fought them off using makeshift weapons and managed to survive long enough to be rescued by a Royal Navy vessel. This incident confirmed what little was already known about the Sentinelese. They were aggressive, territorial, and unwilling to tolerate outsiders on their land. Another major shipwreck that had a lasting impact on the Sentinelese occurred in 1974 when the MV Primrose, a large Hong Kong-based freighter, ran aground on the island's reef. The crew, stranded on the wreck, quickly realized that they were in grave danger when they spotted Sentinelese warriors gathering on the beach, armed with bows and arrows. They immediately radioed for help, requesting an urgent rescue before the islanders could reach them. Fortunately for the crew, rough seas and strong waves prevented the Sentinelese from successfully launching their canoes toward the wreck. After a tense few days, a rescue operation was carried out by the Indian Navy, which airlifted the crew to safety before the Sentinelese could attack. However, the abandoned ship remained lodged on the reef, and over time, the Sentinelese began to scavenge the wreck for materials. This was a significant moment in Sentinelese history because, for the first time, they had access to large quantities of metal, a resource they had never been able to produce themselves. Over the following years, visitors who observed the island from a distance reported seeing Sentinelese warriors carrying spears tipped with metal and arrows with iron tips. This suggests that they had adapted shipwreck materials into their weaponry, making use of modern technology without any direct interaction with the outside world. While the Sentinelese clearly found some use for materials from shipwrecks, this did not change their fundamental hostility toward outsiders. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, several fishermen and illegal poachers have strayed too close to the island, often with deadly consequences. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 2006, when two Indian fishermen, Sundar Raj and Pundit Tiwari, were illegally fishing near North Sentinel Island. Their boat, anchored too close to the island, accidentally drifted ashore while they were asleep. The Sentinelese immediately attacked, killing both men and dragging their bodies away. When the Indian Coast Guard attempted to retrieve their remains using a helicopter, they were met with a barrage of arrows from Sentinelese warriors, forcing them to abandon the mission. This incident reaffirmed that, even after centuries of occasional exposure to the outside world, the Sentinelese remained just as hostile and unwelcoming as ever. Another high-profile case was that of John Allen Chow, an American missionary who, in 2018, illegally traveled to North Sentinel Island in an attempt to convert the Sentinelese to Christianity. Chow had been warned about the dangers of approaching the tribe, but he believed it was his divine mission to spread his faith to the uncontacted people. He paid local fishermen to take him near the island, then used a small canoe to paddle ashore. His first attempt at contact did not go well. The Sentinelese shot an arrow at him, which struck his Bible. Despite this warning, he made another attempt the following day. This time, he did not return. The fisherman who had helped him reported seeing his body being dragged along the beach, confirming that he had been killed. Just like the fisherman in 2006, his body was never recovered, as the Indian authorities refused to disturb the Sentinelese or risk further confrontation. The hostility displayed by the Sentinelese in these encounters is not simply aggression. It is a calculated and deeply ingrained survival strategy. Their limited interactions with the outside world have only reinforced their belief that outsiders bring danger, whether in the form of violence, disease, or disruption to their way of life. Unlike some other indigenous groups that have become dependent on outside goods, the Sentinelese have remained entirely self-sufficient, using only what washes up on their shores without seeking further engagement. Each accidental contact has only strengthened the argument that the Sentinelese should be left alone. The Indian government, learning from these incidents, has since established a strict exclusion zone around North Sentinel Island, ensuring that no one, whether researchers, tourists, or fishermen, can legally approach the island. However, this has not stopped occasional trespassers, and as long as the waters remain a route for fishing and shipping, the possibility of future unintentional encounters remains. As one of the last truly uncontacted tribes on Earth, the Sentinelese present a unique challenge to modern governments. How does one protect a group of people who neither recognize nor acknowledge the authority of any nation? Should efforts be made to integrate them into modern civilization, or should they be left to live as they always have? Over the decades, the Indian government has taken various approaches to the question of how best to deal with the Sentinelese, ultimately choosing a policy of strict isolation and legal protection to preserve their way of life. After India gained independence in 1947, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands officially became part of the Indian Union. However, North Sentinel Island remained an exception, a place that, despite being within Indian territory, had no active governance, no infrastructure, and no permanent presence of law enforcement or administration. For several decades, the Sentinelese were simply ignored, as they had been during the latter years of British rule. However, with the rise of anthropological research in the 1960s and 1970s, interest in the tribe grew. Some Indian officials and researchers, particularly T.N. Pundit, sought to make contact with the Sentinelese, believing that they could be gradually introduced to modern society, much like other Andamanese tribes had been. These efforts, however, failed, as the Sentinelese repeatedly rejected all attempts at communication, often with violent resistance. By the 1990s, the Indian government re-evaluated its approach. Seeing the disastrous effects of forced assimilation on other indigenous groups, many of whom had suffered from disease, cultural erosion, and loss of identity, India officially abandoned efforts to contact the Sentinelese. Instead, the government took a new stance, to leave them completely undisturbed and ensure that outsiders did not interfere with their way of life. One of the most significant legal steps was taken in 2005, when the Indian government declared North Sentinel Island and its surrounding waters a protected area. This meant that no one was legally allowed to approach the island without express government permission. The restrictions extended to a 5-kilometer exclusion zone, ensuring that fishermen, tourists, and researchers could not come close enough to disturb the tribe. The policy was further strengthened in 2017, when the Indian government passed laws stating that even attempting to make contact with the Sentinelese was a criminal offense. This move was not only about protecting the Sentinelese from harm, it was also about protecting outsiders from the violent and unpredictable response of the tribe. Anyone found violating these laws faced severe penalties, including fines and imprisonment. Despite these legal protections, there have been numerous violations. In 2006, 2 Indian fishermen illegally entered the restricted waters around North Sentinel while poaching crabs. Their boat drifted too close to shore while they were asleep, and they were killed by the Sentinelese. When the Indian authorities sent helicopters to recover their bodies, they were met with arrows and spears, forcing them to abandon the mission. One of the most high-profile cases occurred in 2018, when American missionary John Allen Chow attempted to illegally contact the Sentinelese. Ignoring all warnings, he paid local fishermen to take him close to the island, then paddled ashore in a canoe. He was quickly killed by the tribe, and his body was never recovered. This incident sparked international debate, with some advocating for the tribe's continued protection and others arguing that governments had no right to prevent missionaries or researchers from reaching them. Following Chow's death, the Indian government reaffirmed its strict protection policies, ensuring that no future attempts at contact would be tolerated. The authorities made it clear that the Sentinelese should be left alone and that their isolation was to be respected at all costs. Beyond legal restrictions, there is also the question of enforcement. Since the Sentinelese have no formal recognition of Indian law, the government does not station any officials on the island. Instead, protection efforts rely on Coast Guard patrols and aerial surveillance. The Indian Navy and Coast Guard regularly monitor the surrounding waters, ensuring that no fishermen, poachers, or illegal tourists attempt to enter the restricted zone. While the Indian government's stance has been largely successful in preserving Sentinelese isolation, there are still ongoing challenges. The waters around North Sentinel Island remain active fishing routes, and occasional shipwrecks or accidental trespassing continue to occur. Climate change and rising sea levels may also pose long-term threats to the island's ecosystem, potentially forcing the Sentinelese to adapt in ways they never have before. Despite these concerns, India's policies have ensured that the Sentinelese remain one of the few uncontacted tribes left untouched by modern civilization. While other indigenous groups around the world have been forcibly assimilated, suffered from disease, or lost their traditional ways of life, the Sentinelese continue to thrive in the same manner as they have for thousands of years. One of the greatest threats to the Sentinelese people is not war, invasion, or even modern technology. It is disease. The Sentinelese have lived in complete isolation for thousands of years, which means they have not been exposed to many of the viruses and bacteria that the rest of the world has developed immunity to. While the modern population has adapted to common illnesses like the flu, measles, smallpox, and tuberculosis, these diseases could be devastating and potentially fatal to the Sentinelese if they were ever introduced to their community. This vulnerability is not unique to the Sentinelese. Throughout history, uncontacted indigenous groups across the world have suffered massive population declines after exposure to outside diseases. For example, when European colonists arrived in the Americas, they unknowingly carried smallpox, measles, and influenza, which wiped out millions of Native Americans. Similarly, in the 19th and 20th centuries, many of the indigenous tribes of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, including the Great Andamanese, Onge, and Shompen, saw their populations decline drastically due to epidemics brought by outsiders. The Sentinelese, however, have managed to avoid this fate so far. Their extreme isolation has protected them from modern diseases, allowing them to maintain their traditional way of life without the biological threats that wiped out so many other indigenous groups. But this also means that if even one sick outsider were to come into contact with them, the consequences could be catastrophic. Imagine what would happen if a common flu virus, a mild inconvenience for most of the modern world, were to reach the Sentinelese. Because their immune systems have never encountered this virus before, their bodies would have no natural defenses against it. What is a simple cold for us could spread uncontrollably, leading to high fevers, respiratory failure, and death. Worse, diseases like measles or tuberculosis, which have been nearly eradicated in many parts of the world due to vaccines, could trigger an unstoppable epidemic, potentially wiping out the entire tribe within a single generation. There is historical precedent for such a disaster. The indigenous populations of the Amazon rainforest, for example, have suffered repeated epidemics due to unwanted contact with missionaries, loggers, and illegal miners. In some cases, entire villages have been completely wiped out because of something as simple as a handshake or a shared meal with an outsider. This is precisely why modern anthropologists and governments take such extreme precautions when dealing with uncontacted tribes, because one small mistake can lead to the extinction of an entire people. The Sentinelese are also genetically unique, as their ancestors have lived in isolation for thousands of years. This means that their immune systems may not even function the same way as those of other populations. Some experts believe that their genetic makeup might make them even more susceptible to certain infections, which could make even mild illnesses deadly. This is one of the key reasons why the Indian government has enforced such strict isolation laws around North Sentinel Island. The 5-kilometer exclusion zone is not just to protect outsiders from the Sentinelese, but also to protect the Sentinelese from the modern world. Even if an outsider has no intention of harming them, simply breathing near them, touching their food, or leaving behind contaminated objects could be enough to start a deadly outbreak. This also explains why medical intervention is not an option. Some might argue that vaccines should be given to the Sentinelese to help protect them, but this is simply not possible. First, their hostility toward outsiders makes any medical intervention impractical and dangerous. The moment an outsider steps onto their land, they are met with arrows and spears, making it impossible to administer any kind of treatment. Second, vaccines require a controlled medical environment. The Sentinelese would need multiple doses, follow-ups, and medical supervision, which is impossible without completely disrupting their way of life. Even if a vaccine were administered, they could still be vulnerable to countless other infections from common bacteria and viruses that exist in the outside world. There is also the ethical question of whether outsiders even have the right to interfere with the Sentinelese. Many argue that forcing medical intervention upon them would be a form of colonialism, stripping them of their right to decide how they live. The Sentinelese have survived for thousands of years without modern medicine, and while their life expectancy may be shorter than that of the average modern human, they have clearly developed their own methods for handling illness and injury. Their traditional knowledge of medicinal plants, along with a low population density and natural diet, may have helped them avoid many of the common health issues faced by other societies. Unlike industrialized populations, they do not suffer from diseases related to pollution, processed foods, or sedentary lifestyles. However, this does not mean they are immune to the dangers of outside diseases, only that they have managed to avoid them so far. This extreme biological vulnerability is a key reason why all contact attempts have been abandoned. In the past, some researchers and missionaries believed that isolated tribes needed to be saved from their primitive existence and introduced to modern civilization. However, history has shown that forced contact almost always leads to disaster, whether through disease, cultural destruction, or economic dependence. Thus, the best way to protect the Sentinelese is not to try to change them, but to leave them alone. They have survived longer than most civilizations without outside help, and as long as they remain untouched, they have a chance to continue doing so. But even one accidental exposure to a common disease could change that forever,